Let me tell you a story about a quiet veteran who just wanted to live in peace, and the HOA president who made that impossible. It all started with something so small, something most of us would never think twice about a parking spot. But in an HOA community, even the smallest things can be twisted into a battlefield. And what the president of this HOA didn't know was that the man he was messing with had faced battles far tougher than this. This wasn't just about painted lines on pavement. It was about respect, principle, and a veteran who refused to be bullied. John Miller was a retired Army sergeant who had moved into the neighborhood after years of service. He wasn't the type to stir up trouble. His life had been defined by discipline, sacrifice, and honor. After serving his country for decades, he just wanted to enjoy his retirement and peace morning walks with his dog, quiet evenings with his wife, and maybe a little gardening on weekends. But peace didn't last long. His HOA had a reputation for being strict, and at the center of it all was HOA President Greg Wallace. Greg was the kind of man who treated his position like he was running the Pentagon. Clipboard in hand, Greg walked the neighborhood daily, handing out violation notices like candy. Too many decorations? Violation. Grass an inch too high? Violation. But when it came to John Miller, Greg found his favorite target. The conflict began one hot afternoon. John had parked his truck a beat-up but well-maintained pickup from his Army days right in front of his house. It wasn't blocking anyone. It wasn't in a restricted zone. It was simply parked along the curb where he had every right to leave it, but Greg didn't see it that way. The next morning, John found a violation slip tucked under his windshield wiper. In big bold letters it read, "Improper vehicle parking, fine, $250. John stared at it in disbelief. He wasn't breaking any rules. He knew the HOA guidelines well enough. But instead of arguing, he decided to handle it calmly. He took the violation notice straight to the HOA office and asked for clarification. That's when the real battle began. Greg was sitting at the front desk, smug as ever. "Mr. Miller," he said, without even looking up from his clipboard, "that truck is a commercial vehicle. Commercial vehicles are not allowed to park on residential streets overnight." John's brows furrowed. "Commercial vehicle? That's my personal truck? No logos, no business use, nothing?" "It's the same truck I've had for years," Greg smirked. "It's too big." "That makes it commercial by appearance. Rules are rules." John clenched his jaw. He could feel his patience thinning, but he wasn't about to lose his temper. "With all due respect, sir, I didn't serve 20 years in the Army to be told I can't park in front of my own house. If you want to fine me, you'd better have proof in writing that my truck violates the bylaws." Greg didn't like that answer. In fact, it was clear he wasn't used to being challenged. "Mr. Miller," he sneered, "you can either move the truck or pay the fine, simple as that." That night, John left his truck exactly where it was. And that's when things started to escalate. The next morning, another violation. This time, the fine doubled. A week later, Greg sent a letter threatening legal action if John didn't comply. What should have been a small disagreement had turned into an all-out war, and Greg wasn't backing down. But here's the thing about veterans like John. They don't back down either. Because what Greg didn't know was that John was already preparing his own counterattack. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to argue. He was going to fight smart using the HOA's own rules against them. And when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't just expose Greg's abuse of power, it would turn the entire neighborhood against him. Still following your guidelines, approximately 850 words, narration style, paragraphs longer than 2 lines, suspense-driven. John Miller wasn't the kind of man who backed down from a fight when he knew he was right. But he also wasn't reckless. The Army had taught him patience, strategy, and the value of using rules to his advantage. If Greg wanted to play a game of bylaws and regulations, Then John would play too, except John would actually read the rules, not twist them to fit his ego. That night, John sat at his kitchen table with the thick HOA handbook in front of him. Page by page, he read through every section, every clause, every fine print rule. His wife, Linda, walked in and saw the stack of papers. "You're really going after this, aren't you?" she asked softly. John looked up, his eyes tired but determined. "I spent 20 years making sure soldiers followed the rules. I know what rules mean, and I know what abuse of power looks like. This isn't about a truck anymore. It's about him thinking he can control people however he wants. If he's wrong, I'll prove it, and I'll make sure everyone sees it." The next day, John began documenting everything. He took photos of his truck from every angle, no company logos, no business equipment, just a regular pickup. He printed out the HOA guidelines highlighting the section that specifically defined commercial vehicles. According to the bylaws, a commercial vehicle had to display business markings or exceed a certain weight limit, neither of which applied to his truck. But John didn't stop there. He also started taking pictures of other vehicles around the neighborhood. Vans with magnetic business signs, landscaping trucks parked overnight, even Greg's own SUV, which technically violated another rule about oversized mirrors. If Greg wanted to call John's truck a violation, then half the neighborhood was guilty too. A week later, the HOA held their monthly board meeting. Normally, these meetings were dull affairs, budget talks, landscaping updates, maybe a complaint about trash pickup. But this time, word had already spread that John Miller planned to challenge Greg. The room was packed with homeowners. Curious to see what would happen, Greg sat at the head of the table, smug as always. When John entered, Greg didn't even greet him. He simply shuffled some papers and cleared his throat. Next order of business: the ongoing violation concerning Mr. Miller's vehicle. The room grew quiet. John stood up slowly, a folder in hand. His voice was steady, calm, but carried a sharp edge. "With all due respect, Mr. President," John began, "you've accused me of violating HOA rules by parking my personal truck on the street. You fined me, threatened legal action, and attempted to intimidate me. But I've done my homework." He opened his folder and laid copies of the HOA bylaws on the table. According to Section 4B, a commercial vehicle is defined as one bearing business signage or exceeding 10,000 pounds. My truck has neither. It is not commercial. Your fines are baseless. Greg shifted uncomfortably, but before he could speak, John continued. He held up photos of other vehicles in the neighborhood. "And if we're going to talk about enforcement, then let's talk about consistency. If my truck is a violation, then so is the landscaping van parked across from me every night. So is the delivery van 2 streets over. And let's not forget your SUV, Mr. Wallace, which happens to violate the mirror width rule under Section 7A. A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Homeowners glanced at each other, some smirking, some glaring at Greg. Greg slammed his hand on the table. "This meeting is not about me, it's about your vehicle, Mr. Miller." John didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his voice low but powerful. "No, Mr. President, this meeting is about abuse of power. You've been using your position to target me, not because of my truck, but because you think no one will stand up to you. Well, I'm standing, and I won't be the last." For the first time, Greg looked rattled. He fumbled through his papers, but the evidence was stacked against him. John had cornered him with his own rules, and the board members knew it. One of the other board members, a woman named Sandra, cleared her throat. "I think Mr. Miller has made a compelling case. Unless anyone has proof otherwise, I don't see grounds for these fines to stand." Greg's face turned red. "We can't just let him park wherever he wants. If we let one person bend the rules, the whole community falls apart." But Sandra shook her head. "No one is bending the rules. You are. This isn't about community standards anymore. It's about fairness. By the end of the meeting, Greg had been forced to rescind the fines. The board voted unanimously in John's favor. The crowd applauded, and for once, Greg didn't have the last word. He stormed out of the room, his clipboard clutched tight in his hand, his authority slipping through his fingers. John walked home that night with Linda at his side. He should have felt victorious, but deep down, he knew Greg wasn't finished. People like Greg never quit when they lose. They just find new ways to fight. And John was right, because while the fines stopped, the harassment was only just beginning. End of Part 2, Part 3. For a few days, peace returned to the neighborhood. John's truck sat in its usual spot without a single violation notice taped to the windshield. Neighbors gave him nods of approval, some even clapping him on the back and whispering things like, "Glad someone finally put Greg in his place." For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, John felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. But Greg Wallace wasn't a man who let go of grudges. If anything, the embarrassment at the board meeting had only fueled his anger. He had been publicly humiliated by John, and in Greg's mind, that wasn't something he could forgive. No, Greg wanted revenge, and he didn't care if he had to twist the rules even further to get it. It began with small things. A notice about John's trash bins being left out too long when they were clearly put away on time. A warning about his grass being half an inch too high. Even a letter claiming his American flag wasn't mounted properly, despite the fact that John had followed flag protocol to the letter. At first, John laughed it off. He had expected this. Bullies didn't stop after one loss, they doubled down. But as the weeks passed, the notices piled up, and it became clear that Greg wasn't just being petty. He was building a case, trying to overwhelm John with paper violations in hopes of scaring him into submission. Linda grew worried. "John, this is harassment." "He won't stop until he breaks us. What if he drags us into court?" John placed a reassuring hand over hers. "And then we'll fight him there too. But I'm not letting this man run us out of our home. He picked the wrong veteran to mess with." What Greg didn't realize was that John had already shifted tactics. He wasn't just defending himself anymore, he was preparing to go on the offensive. He documented every false violation, photographed the timestamp on his trash cans, recorded the grass measurements, and even filmed the flag flapping proudly in compliance. More importantly, John began speaking with neighbors quietly, carefully asking if they'd had similar issues with Greg. The stories came pouring out. Families fined for minor landscaping differences. Parents threatened because their kids chalked on the sidewalks. Elderly residents harassed over garden gnomes and bird feeders. Everyone had a story, and everyone had been too afraid to speak up, but John wasn't afraid. And now, neither were they. The breaking point came one Saturday morning when John discovered a final notice taped to his door. Greg was claiming John owed $5,000 in accumulated fines and that legal action was pending if the amount wasn't paid. John didn't shout, he didn't rage. He simply smiled, tucked the notice into his folder, and said, "It's time." That evening, John called an emergency neighborhood meeting, not an HOA meeting, but a homeowner meeting. He invited every resident who had ever been wronged, every person who had felt the weight of Greg's abuse. The community center was packed. Standing before the crowd, John laid out his evidence, his truck photos, the false violations, and finally, the ridiculous $5,000 fine. Then, one by one, neighbors stood up and shared their own experiences. Each story painted Greg not as a responsible leader, but as a dictator who had used fear and fines to control the community. When the meeting ended, a plan was set into motion. Together, the residents drafted a petition to remove Greg Wallace from his position as HOA president. According to the bylaws, if enough signatures were gathered, a vote could be forced. Greg didn't see it coming. For years he had ruled with intimidation, never realizing that one day the people he bullied would band together against him. Within a week, John and the neighbors had more than enough signatures. The petition was delivered to the board and the special election was scheduled. The night of the vote, the atmosphere was electric. Neighbors filled the room, whispering, waiting for the showdown. Greg walked in with his usual arrogance, still convinced he had loyal supporters. But when the ballots were counted, the result was undeniable. Greg Wallace was voted out as HOA president. The room erupted in applause. Some cheered, some cried in relief. Greg sat there in stunned silence, his face pale, his clipboard useless in his lap. John didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Instead, he stood and addressed the room. This was never just about my truck. This was about fairness, respect, and community. We all deserve to live in peace without fear of harassment. Today we proved that one man's power ends where our unity begins. Greg was forced to step down immediately, his reign of petty tyranny over. A new president was elected, Sandra, the fair-minded board member who had stood up for John during the truck dispute. From that day forward, the HOA began rebuilding trust with the residents, focusing on community rather than control. As for John, he continued parking his truck exactly where it had always been. Every time he looked at it, he felt a quiet satisfaction, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been too afraid to fight back. Linda squeezed his hand one evening and whispered, "You didn't just win against Greg, you gave this neighborhood its voice back." And John, the soldier who had spent his life fighting for freedom, simply nodded. Because once again he had stood his ground against a bully, and this time victory didn't belong to him alone.